Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here today. I think this is a great opportunity to gather together, and the lineup of speakers following me sounds really compelling. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay to hear all of them, so I'm really glad this is being recorded so that I can catch up afterwards. But the diversity of people that we're going to hear from today is a great aspect of this presentation. As mentioned, my name's Scott. Scott Heron. I work in the physics department at James Cook University. And part of my research work is involved with coral reefs. Now you might ask the question, what does physics have to do with coral reefs? And that could be a really valid question. But the key thing from my perspective is the linking part is climate change. Climate change is all to do with physics. And so the climate change that we have already seen, that we are predicted to see in coming decades through this century, and I hope not much more than that, but we will all see it's going to take a long time for the climate system to return to what we had been previously. But that's all physics. But the physics of changing temperatures, changing currents in the ocean, all influences our Great Barrier Reef. And that's where I work together from a physics perspective with a bunch of fantastic marine chemists, marine biologists, marine geologists to bring the stories together. But I'm kind of jumping ahead a bit. I wanted to tell you that recently we just painted the inside of our house. Well, at least most of it. There's still the bedrooms that we've got to come to. But what it meant was we took everything off the walls. We took everything away from the walls. We papered over, filled in with spac filler, all of the holes, all of those sorts of things. And now we have a clean slate. And if there's anyone who's thinking about next Saturday and wondering where they stand from a climate perspective, I'd invite you to paint your walls clean and start afresh by looking at the storyline. Because I think we have an opportunity to do that with respect to climate change in our election choices coming up. And I want to acknowledge the candidates who have been able to join us today, and thank you for being here. I know that was an invitation, but I'm sorry you're not the most important people. Or at least you're not any more important than any of the others sitting here who will cast a ballot. Because this is our collective decision on how we go forwards. And so I want to firstly reflect on that by saying your vote is powerful. It's an important thing. Make sure that you go to the ballot box, if you haven't been already, by next Saturday, so that your voice gets registered. But it's not the only voice you have. We can all make decisions in our day-to-day life that have influences on our own families, influences on other people in our community, influences on people we'll never meet who live in another country who are still our neighbours on this planet. And I think it's an important perspective that we reflect on those people as our neighbours. You may have seen in the news recently that the assessments, the analysis of aerial surveys of the Great Barrier Reef this year have shown that there has been another coral bleaching event. Now, just for perspective, and I'm telling you this from the viewpoint of a physicist, so I'm pretty low on the biological detail. But corals, the first question, animal, vegetable, mineral, and the answer is yes. The coral is an animal that coexists with a plant that photosynthesizes and provides energy so that it can lay down a huge calcium carbonate skeleton that we can see from space in the Great Barrier Reef. Animal, vegetable, and mineral. And high temperature affects that nutrition relationship between the plants that get a home inside the coral tissue. They pay their rent through energy, helping the coral to have enough energy to build this massive reef structure. When temperatures get high, they can become more efficient. Things speed up when they heat up. But if they get too high, then instead of providing good carbohydrates, that relationship turns into a toxic relationship. And so you pull out the eviction notice, out go the plants, and they take with them the pretty colors. And all we get left with is the translucent or transparent tissue of the coral animal and that calcium carbonate white structure skeleton underneath. And that's why it's called bleaching. If bleaching persists for a long time, it can lead to death, starvation in essence. But if the bleaching conditions, those causes, abate, then the corals can survive through that. Thankfully, this year, it looks like a lot of the bleaching will have stopped at just bleaching. It won't have turned into coral mortality for most of the locations, not all, most of the locations. That's in contrast to the 2016 and 2017 events, where between those two events, we saw an estimated 50% of shallow water corals dying. But the 2016 event also revealed another mechanism that was impacting corals. It wasn't this notion of starvation after a period of stress. It was a rapid mortality. Corals were, in essence, getting cooked. They were rapidly dying, tissue sloughing off them. And when a coral bleaching event happens and there's mortality associated, you hear descriptions of people talking about the smell of death in the water. It's true. That is an accurate observation. In the past 7 summers, we've seen 4 coral bleaching events widespread on the Great Barrier Reef. That's not natural. I'm sick of the words unprecedented and record-breaking. I mean, last week we had record-breaking rain. We had that earlier in this summer as well, down in the south coast, north coast of New South Wales, southeast corner of Queensland. We've seen unprecedented and record-breaking bushfires, wildfires. And not just here in Australia, they're currently happening in California. We're currently seeing fires in Siberia where it's supposed to be frozen. It's not just our Great Barrier Reef that's seeing these impacts. But I want to come back to the reef and pose a reflection to you. 23 years ago, there was a seminal paper published by one of the people I respect in my work area, my research area, respect very highly, Professor Ove Hergulberg from the University of Queensland. He published a paper using IPCC modelling from 1996. And in 1996, the models that were built then, run then, looking to the future, said it's going to be around 2016 that we're going to see the increase in temperatures reach the point where corals typically will be bleaching. Did I mention that we saw a severe coral bleaching event on the GBR as a part of a global bleaching event in 2016? It's 2017, 2020, 2022. At the moment, there's also coral bleaching being seen in Ningaloo, in Shark Bay in Western Australia. They're also World Heritage properties, like the Great Barrier Reef is, like Lord Howe Island and its corals is a World Heritage property. Corals and Lord Howe that have bleached within the last 3 years. Do you get a picture that something is happening here around the place with respect to climate change and impacts on corals, impacts on forest fire systems? One other part of my research work looks specifically at the climate vulnerability of World Heritage properties. And we are undertaking analyses at different World Heritage properties. There's over 1,100 of these things around the world. I've recently had opportunity to do analyses up near the Arctic Circle in a cultural landscape in Norway. On the east coast of Africa, I'd love to go there. I mean, these places sound magnificent. On the east coast of Africa, and an area that's affected by sea level rise. We've had the predictions of what's happening at the moment. This is not a future thing, this is a now thing. We've had the predictions for over 2 decades. Some scientists would argue it's 50 years that we've had the predictions. And we're seeing the impacts that were predicted 25 years ago already occurring. When we look at the modelling from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the models have already been shown to work. We don't have to ask a question of whether or not they're reliable. They're better today than they were 25 years ago when they got it right, predicting today. It's not a question of, is this reliable? Are these issues actually going to come to pass? That is now realized. It's become a reality. What we need to do is think about our future decisions. And there's other people who are going to be speaking today talking about potential solutions, ideas that are being generated and worked through. And that's fantastic because we need that. We talk about government investments and policy promises about efforts for the Great Barrier Reef. And those that invest in ideas like crown of thorns, starfish monitoring and response action, those that speak about water quality issues and land-based pollution running off into the catchments. They are critical actions. We need those if we're going to help that reef out there manage through the next wave of climate change that's already locked in. But all of those pieces are going to be relative band-aids compared with what we need to do to address the root cause. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has stated that the major threat to our reef is climate change. We need to have significant and immediate action on that. And we're not talking about action that will limit warming to 3 degrees Celsius in the next 30 years. 2 degrees is still a little bit too much for corals in the next 30 years. Every 1/10 of a degree matters for our reef. But why do we care about the reef so much? Is it just because it's an amazing ecosystem that's visible from space? Well, yeah. Is it because it forms habitat for myriad organisms that live and grow out in that space in the waters? Well, yeah. Around 1/4 of all fish species have some part of their life cycle on coral reefs. Whew. Is it about the 60-odd thousand people whose jobs, whose livelihoods depend upon a healthy Great Barrier Reef? Yeah. Is it about all of us knowing that this is one part of our global ecosystem and that there are many impacts happening in our global ecosystem? Yes. It doesn't matter which one of those ways that you enter into it. I'll tell you where I come to it. It's my kids. It's my nieces and my nephew. It's their friends. It's the kids that I'm an uncle to, but not by blood. And it's the kids that I'm never going to meet in my life. For me, it's about the kids. And so that helps to inspire me every day to make a decision to not buy a second car, but instead ride my bike, including during last week's rain. But that's a me thing. That's not for everyone, and not everybody has a job or an occupation, whether it's employed or not, that enables that. But there's more and more options that are appearing for all of us in terms of our energy generation personally, in terms of the choices and decisions that we make as individuals. But next Saturday, we get a chance to bring those together and speak to our leadership. So as we're here in this place, I encourage you to, as you head towards the ballot box, whether it's this week, whether it's on Saturday, or whether it's the next time around that you're heading because you've already logged in for this time, just remember the reef. Don't forget about that piece. And then remember everyone else in your community and however far and wide you speak to your community. Folks, I thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it, and I thank NQCC for this event now. I encourage and commend to you again the rest of the speakers that you're going to hear from, because you're going to hear some wonderful stories and you're going to hear some great passion. Thank you.